Good afternoon, everyone. I'm calling the meeting to order. Welcome to the 36th meeting of the Standing Committee on Indigenous and Northern Affairs.
The territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation. My name is Mark Garneau. I'd like to welcome our witnesses who have joined us for this afternoon as we study Bill C-29. We have with us Dr. Marie Wilson, former Commissioner of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, appearing in person. We have Zebedee Nungak, also appearing in person, and Marjolaine Chernich, Directrice Générale de l'Institut Tchakapèche, par vidéoconférence. To ensure an orderly meeting, I'd like to outline a few rules to follow. Members or witnesses may speak in the official language of their choice. Interpretation services in English, French, and Inuktitut are available for today's meeting. Please be patient with the interpretation. It takes a little while to get the translation done. For those in the video conference, the interpretation button is found at the bottom of your screen. It's a small globe, and you can listen in either Floor, English, French, or Inuktitut. If interpretation is lost, please inform me immediately, and we will ensure interpretation is properly restored before we continue. Before speaking, please wait until I recognize you by name. When you are not speaking, your microphone should be on mute. When speaking, and this is very important, please speak slowly and clearly. This is for the benefit of the interpreters. And a reminder that all comments should be addressed through the chair. Each witnesses will now be invited to make an opening statement of 5 minutes, which will then be followed by questions from the members of the committee. So we'll begin with Dr. Wilson. I'd like to invite you, Doctor, to begin with your opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and greetings to everyone. I'm really glad to be here on Algonquin territory. I'm here visiting from the Northwest Territories from Treaty 8, and it's nice to be in a room with my Member of Parliament and one of our fellow Northerners, Member Idlaud as well. As mentioned, I was one of the commissioners of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and what that means for today is that I was also one of the authors of the call to action that informs this particular legislative proposal. As you know, we crisscrossed the country for 6.5 years, listening to a very mixed legacy of painful achievements and devastating losses, including, as we all know by now, the loss of life itself in the thousands and still counting. Our multi-volume final reports and various summaries reflect all that we heard, and our 10 principles of reconciliation and our 94 calls to action charted a pathway forward for Canada, addressing action areas for all levels of government and all sectors of society. And among those was a call for a National Council for Reconciliation. The significance of that is we repeatedly heard from friends and colleagues both in Canada and internationally who had been involved in commissions and inquiries before. There's a need for an ongoing oversight mechanism. Otherwise, things get forgotten and left on dusty shelves. There's a need for follow-up, and not as a way to hold up continuing shame, but on the contrary, to be able to track and monitor progress, hopefully improvement, and so that we can get all the full benefits of our work and the work of survivors for lasting impact to the benefit of all. Today, I want to make reference in passing to our call to action, but I want to mostly, given time, point out areas where I hope you'll be open to hearing some suggestions for improvement of what is before you in your proposed legislation. In 2015, on the 5-year anniversary at that point of our report from the TRC, we expressed great frustration and concern about the slowness of fulfillment of the calls to action, and we specifically singled out the National Council for Reconciliation. The reason for that then is today is to say, finally, here we are. And I hope you'll hear what I'm saying as potentially areas for improvement and not as anything that I hope would ever be used as further delay, reasons for further delay. I want to make observations in 3 specific areas. The first is reconciliation as a shared purpose. And I'll just say for the analysts and others, there is a longer form of this paper which I'll provide for your purposes, but I'm just headlining here and hoping I'm not being too negative in the process. The Bill 29 summary says the purpose of the proposed legislation is to advance efforts for reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. I think the purpose statement itself can and should be much stronger, not just to advance efforts for reconciliation, but to ensure reconciliation, and not just with Indigenous peoples, but between and among Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. As we said throughout our reports and repeatedly ever since, that reconciliation is about the establishment and maintenance of respectful relations between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples, as we've described many times over. The C-29 recognizes the need for an establishment of an independent, non-political permanent organization, and I would just offer that that language too could be even more precise to ensure that the non-political meaning is both independence from government but also non-partisan in spirit. And that would be to protect its longevity no matter which political party prevails in government over the years ahead. The draft also uses the term Indigenous-led. Our TRC call to action does not use that terminology. Again, we specifically insisted over the course of the Commission and repeatedly since that reconciliation is not an Indigenous issue, it's a Canadian one. And the very fact that we have this deliberation before a committee that is narrowcast as Indigenous and Northern Affairs underscores how easily reconciliation gets recast as an Indigenous problem. And that's why we commissioners were very deliberate and precise in our wording in describing the oversight body with membership jointly appointed by the Government of Canada and national Aboriginal organizations, using the terminology of the day, and consisting of Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal members. The C-29 proposal as worded, including its model for appointment, rather than through a collaborative approach, creates a silo approach that potentially divides the Council internally before it ever begins. And I have comparative examples that I could offer if time allows in the discussion. The second point I want to address is accountability to Parliament. And this is all about public awareness and accountability for improvement. The section about reporting to Parliament that we had in our call to action is entirely missing from the C-29 draft. Parliament is where the laws were passed to enact residential schools. The House of Commons is where national political leaders stood in front of national Indigenous leaders to apologize for the fallout of those schools and to promise to move forward in the spirit of reconciliation. And Parliament is where all Canadians have an elected representative to hear regular progress reports on whether we are actually living up to these latest promises made on behalf of the people of Canada. So I want to stress that this public accountability also provides transparency for prioritizing what we need to do next, to celebrate indeed where things are getting better, and to fuel our encouragement as a country to keep at it and to keep trying. On the point of financial resources, I won't say a lot, I'll just say this, that regarding financial resources, the draft is simply too generic on that point, with a generalized reference to a further call to action 55. In my experience and intention, without certainty of resources, focuses all early efforts simply on trying to find the means to function. So I want to conclude by reminding you of 3 of the TRC principles of reconciliation that are especially relevant to my points today and to your deliberations. Number 6, all Canadians as treaty peoples share responsibility for establishing and maintaining mutually respectful relationships. Number 9, reconciliation requires political will, joint leadership, trust building, accountability, and transparency, as well as a substantial investment of resources. And number 10, reconciliation requires sustained public education and dialogue, including youth engagement about the history and legacy of schools, treaties and Aboriginal rights, as well as the history and contemporary contributions of Aboriginal peoples to Canadian society. I believe there's great urgency to this call to action, and since we've already agreed, all parties across the House, that this is a priority, and in recent elections, recommitments were made on the issue of reconciliation as well, so that I hope with a few amendments to strengthen the purpose and potential of this legislative proposal, that all parliamentarians will move quickly to get the National Council for Reconciliation enacted and fairly resourced as soon as possible. We've called it a vital tool for our country to reap the benefits of ongoing education, introspection, course correction, and celebration. And it's an honest mirror, hopefully, that will help us all become the world leader we claim we wish to be in matters of good and respectful relations between Indigenous and non-Indigenous citizens. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Wilson. We'll now go to our second witness, Zebedee Nungak. Mr. Nungak, you have the microphone.
First of all, thank you. I will be speaking in my own language. Our language, the federal government tried to erase our language. And because
in these presentations, and I had prepared an 8-page summary of what I wanted to say to the committee members. However, time constraints, I will read only one of those pages to give the sense of where I'm coming from on the definition and the issue of reconciliation, which I equate very strongly with decolonization. The word reconciliation has been in national circulation since 2008, when Canada's government established the Truth and Reconciliation Commission to examine the matter of Indian residential schools. This commission produced a report containing 94 calls to action designed to facilitate quote-unquote reconciliation between Canada's colonial governments and the Indigenous peoples. However, the word reconciliation is a misnomer and totally off the mark of its truth. Here's why. Reconciliation assumes that sometime long ago, there existed a utopian state of quote-unquote conciliation between colonial governments and Indigenous peoples. This implies relations among equals, with neither side being superior or inferior to the other. Reconciliation suggests that a mutually beneficial balance, which once ruled the relationships between colonial authorities and Indigenous parties, can be rediscovered. As we all know, there has never been any such thing. Ever since immigrants from across the ocean set foot on the territories which eventually became Canada, these immigrants have been superior to all Indigenous peoples who had occupied these territories prior to their arrivals. This superiority is arrogantly deliberate and is so hardened that it continues to be the ruling order of life, right to the present day. From first contact, Indigenous peoples have been treated as inferior beings that don't own any lands or resources. The hallmarks of colonial history are a narrative without a single trace of anything resembling equal to equal respect by colonial powers toward Indigenous peoples whose territories they stole, conquered, or simply took over. Kings of England issued royal charters and proclamations, which arbitrarily dictated the status of Indigenous ancestral lands without the consent of the Indigenous groups affected. In these, there is nothing positive to reconcile to. The colonial format has absolutely nothing for Indigenous inhabitants of the country they quote-unquote founded in 1867. The single mention of original inhabitants in the BNA Act was a one-liner, assigning responsibility for, quote, Indians and lands reserved for Indians to the new federal authority. Canada's so-called founders were not educated enough to know about and acknowledge the existence of the Métis or the Inuit. There's nothing to reconcile to. No state of utopia, which we can simply return to, has ever existed. So let's go back to this word, reconciliation. The meaning of this word is listed in the concise Oxford English Dictionary as, quote, the act of reconciling, an instance or occasion of friendly relations being restored, unquote. Friendly relations first had to have existed before their restoration can be pursued. To seek reconciliation to something that never was is impossible. We can, however, pursue a real objective called decolonization. Governments in Canada have plenty to make up for their bull-headed, coercive policies in attempting to erase Indigenous languages, cultures, and identities. Think of these two words, cultural genocide. Within these words are lost identities, lost languages, lost family ties and cohesion, lost sense of belonging, lost innocence, and lost lives. Repairing all this will take plenty of time and plenty of resources to right these profound wrongs.
Thank you for giving me this opportunity to speak.
My 21 pages of writings on this issue that I have delivered on CBC North Radio in English and Inuktitut over the years to enlighten people like you who are designing activities and actions toward the goal of positively processing something called this reconciliation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Nungak. And I regret that we have to work within time constraints, but we would certainly welcome the full text that you had brought with you. If it was possible to provide that to the clerk, it would get to the members. So thank you very much. And with that, we will go to our next witness, Madame Marjolaine.
Ms. Marjolaine Czernisz, you have the floor for 5 minutes. Ms. Czernisz, I think that you're on mute. There you are. Thank you. I'm sorry.
Merci.
Thank you. Thank you for your invitation to contribute to this process that confirms the whole importance of prior dialogue for the implementation of major projects to help everyone, including members of First Nations in the Quebec region. I am Innu from the community of Uashatmak Maniutanam on the North Shore, and I am the executive director of the Chakapesh Institute. One relevant and respectful way of working with First Nations is to recognize them as a nation And in Bill C-29, we recognize the mother tongue, the language of use, and specific needs and geographical context. Often, the Innu Nation, which has French as its second language, doesn't see itself reflected in the current practice of federal Indigenous relations, which takes place in English. And so we feel excluded from discussions and therefore unempowered to act. So thank you for giving us this opportunity today, because that aspect has to be taken into consideration now. There are socioeconomic consequences from that are huge. The economic situation in our communities is different depending on our geographic location. And we have to be taken into consideration with our realities. It's important to enable First Nations members to use French so that we can take part in the political discussions and to have documentation in our language. We need to be able to express ourselves freely in the official language of our choice. Another thing that I wanted to remind you of, and that is important, is that when the legislation on Indigenous languages was introduced, there was involvement by the AFN, the Inuit Tapiriit Kanatami, and the Métis National Council, but there was not a joint drafting exercise. There was certainly an effort to do good work, but when the bill regarding Indigenous languages was developed, we received information in the regions between the time that the legislation was announced and its adoption. But if it had not been for the member for Manicouagan, I wouldn't have been aware of this bill. This idea of creating a National Council for Reconciliation is important and comes out of the calls to action under the TRC. I want to also talk about the Board of Directors and how it is constituted. We have the Crown Indigenous Relations Secretariat, but we need more people around the table that choose the directors. We need to have Francophone regions of Quebec represented so that we get the proper information. It would be important that 1/3 of the directors be involved in a way that we can recognize racist traditions that have existed. There also needs to be a balance between men and women. This is important for survivals of residential schools and to have accountability. The directors also need to avoid any conflicts of interest. when it comes to the Council. In addition, it is important for the National Council for Reconciliation, when it is created, has the resources it needs to fulfill the mandate entirely from the beginning. Last year, we had the Commissioner for Indigenous Languages that was created, that was designated, and we haven't heard very much about that commission because they have not been able to move forward with their work. So it would have to be different for the National Council for Reconciliation. It needs to hit the ground running. And we need to make sure that their work is accessible and that we can see the results of their work. The point I want to make today is that all participants, federal, provincial, Indigenous, have to provide information to the Council so that the Council can report fully. We need to ensure that the National Council for Reconciliation has the data and information from the federal, provincial, and Indigenous authorities that it requires. What is not indicated in the bill is that where this information needs to come from. That needs to be specified. I don't know if I still have time remaining. You have used all of your time. If you could perhaps quickly conclude. So my last point is that the National Council for Reconciliation when this was discussed, was to ensure reconciliation for families, survivors, and others. And if that is to happen, it needs to be very clearly stated in the bill. That has to be the mandate of the Council. Thank you very much. Perhaps you can elaborate during the question period.
We have a witness who was going to appear in the second hour but needs to appear now, and so I'm going to open the mic to somebody from that second hour, which is Chief Jean-Charles Pietaccio de la Nation Innu.
Chief Pietaccio from the Innu Nation.
Point in time. Chief, Chef, vous avez le micro pour...
You have the mic for 5 minutes, Chief.
Chef, vous êtes en mute?
Chief, you are muted.
Chef Jean-Charles, voilà, voilà. Allez-y, s'il vous plaît.
Parce qu'on était mute.
We were mute for a long time. Yes, it happens to us all. Almost 500 years.
And gaston va payer with the here que nimnenten kahakat ne tuatakanuten the sinan kantara budget macht mak nesi nete tainu jimewaat anishnabenu tasio oteat tabajit nagan. Je vais juste vérifier.
I just want to check whether we have interpretation for you from the Innu.
So, Madam Clerk, do we have interpretation for the chief?
Yes, the interpreter is here. He's standing by, and I believe he's interpreting because I can see people nodding around the room.
Very good. Allez-y.
Please go ahead, Chief Pietaccio.
Ihan näin inusmo Jean-Charles Pietachon de nutine quantit man bayate uste in what in nutem Westayani Gaja. Kin Mrentin Maniat Sejuten Kininan Mintat Ehuapat Mahdi Mahnikan Kinigatet 7 Nafa. Newatu Tagant Kamaminanity Sejuten Twach Code Minopanituna. Ni witin si haputin na witin ne watu takansi wan cha ne kamenwone we ham ne te na hatumagan ne me mahningan gi dastet kaoni pan.
Mr. Chairman, point of order.
Go ahead, sir.
I'm not finding the translation.
Much has already been said about reconciliation and
and then it has to be relayed from French to English.
So is that understood, Mr. McLeod? It's a double one here. It has to go to it's interpreted to translated to English. So it does cause a delay. Alors continuez s'il vous plaît, chef. Continuez de parler de votre présentation.
I could speak another language. It's up to you.
Mr. Chair, the tech personnel is telling me that there's something wrong with the interpretation from French to English. We might have to suspend while we inquire as to what's wrong.
Okay, alors, chef, malheureusement.
So, Chief, there seems to be a problem right now for the interpreter from French to English for some of the members of the committee, so we will just suspend temporarily. Please stand by, and we will give you the floor again.
Nino when stumante gatanete jen kaut nani wasata Nino ehkum chihwa.
I am a residential school survivor, and I remember every day everything that happened at the residential school.
Is that 3 interpreters are at one end of the room and the English interpreter is across the room in a separate booth, so they couldn't see each other. Anyways, we've worked it out, and we're ready to begin if we can begin again from the top.
Very good. Alors,
Chief, please go ahead. Start from the beginning, please. I'll begin again. Please do that, and we will hope to get through your remarks this time. I'm losing my 5 minutes, I feel. I am a residential school survivor, and I remember every day everything that happened in the past. This brings us back into the past. 30 years ago, I find it difficult to have peace. And once again, as we have said often, and we have provided reports, we have consulted lawyers, we've even gone to the government, we have called on you many times for action. We have said that our rights, our language, our knowledge, our territory, our religion, our traditional customs, our history, all of those things need to be recognized. As Innu people, we are people who have lived here, and when you come to our territory, we welcome you. There are words that are important and that have meaning. For example, the word for caribou. We need to have concrete action in order to defend our rights and our elders, the knowledge that our elders have and their language. We have to advocate for that continually. We and our organization feel that the National Council for Reconciliation that is to be created has to take into account our culture and our language. And even the UN has said that language is important. We need also to listen to our elders, and that is what our elders say on our territory. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission called for respect, and we are in the far eastern part of our country. Often decisions are made in the center or in the western part of our country. We need to receive documents in French, which is our second language. We need also to have women take their proper place. We had the National Inquiry on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. Often, people are invited to express themselves. The government needs to hear our voices, and we need to be able to force the provinces and municipalities to work with the new council. It is the Prime Minister that has to be accountable to the National Council for Reconciliation and publish an annual report. and there needs to be this accountability.
Chef.
Thank you very much, Chief, for your presentation. And we apologize for the technical difficulties.
We will go to the round of questions, beginning with Mr. Melillo for 6 minutes.
Actually, Mr. Chair, it's going to be Mr. Vidal. Sorry you didn't get informed of the change.
Okay, no problem. Go ahead, Mr. Vidal.
Thank you, sir. Thank you to all the witnesses today for your testimony and your contribution to this bill and trying to make it as strong and good of a bill as possible. I have a few questions for Ms. Wilson first, please. I appreciate many of the things you said and many of the areas that you struck on, and I'm only going to get to a few of them, but if it sounds like I'm hurrying, it's because I am, because I want to get to a number of them. You talked about the calls to action, and Call to Action 56 explicitly states that the Prime Minister should answer to the National Council for Reconciliation's annual report that gets presented ultimately to Parliament through the Minister. But the legislation actually passes that responsibility to the Minister, not the Prime Minister. Would you agree that that should be amended back to ensuring that the Prime Minister responds and reports to that?
Yes, I personally do agree. And just as I made the point, and no disregard intended to this committee, I also think that anything that narrows the focus to Indigenous only or an Indigenous concern only misses the point of all of Canada. So
Thank
yes,
you.
I do agree.
I appreciate that, and I know I'm kind of doing a little bit of a rapid fire here, so I appreciate your response. You talked as well about independence, and in the bill there's a section on protocol, and Section 16 talks about the Minister in collaboration with the Council developing a protocol respecting the disclosure of information by the Government of Canada to the Council. I guess I'm a little bit concerned, and I wonder if you share that concern, that it would be the responsibility of the Minister to develop the protocol and the information that is provided to the Council. I'm not sure that the Minister should be the one that's dictating the protocol to the Council that's ultimately going to hold the government to account for reconciliation. So would you agree that maybe that language could be changed to have somebody else develop that protocol?
Well, I'm a big supporter of co-development, first of all. As I am with co-drafting of legislation, it's my understanding that this so far has not been co-drafted, so I think that's already a missed opportunity. But I think if you want to have a protocol that serves everyone, then it needs to be co-considered from the conceptual stages onward.
Thank you. You also commented in Section 8, in the initial appointment of the first Board of Directors, again, the language has been softened from what you talked about in the original calls to actions and the recommendations even of the interim board that were made back in 2018, where again it's the Minister, with this clause in collaboration with, but your language says it should be jointly done when we appoint the first Board of Directors. I'm assuming from what you said you would support an amendment to switch that back to jointly appointed for the Board of Directors.
That is my view, but I will just say that in our call to action, we do use the word collaboration. In the call to action, we use both words, but we talk specifically about jointly when it comes to the composition.
Thank you. It's my opinion that done jointly is just a little stronger language, and I would like to see that.
Well, one is sort of more about the spirit of it, and the other is the operational practicality of it. That's how I see it.
Right, that's fair. In your comments, you talked about and I'm coming kind of a little bit back to call to action number 55, which is there's a number of kind of really measurable items in call to action 55 that we could measure progress. There's things that are very quantifiable, and we don't find those actually in the legislation in the purpose and function section. And I'm curious, you said we don't want to shame anyone, but we want to monitor and measure progress effectively. And there's the old saying that kind of what gets measured gets done. And so I wonder if you would support the concept of ensuring that the specific items in call to action 55 are included, but I would like to also suggest maybe not just limited to those, that there would be other measurable items that could help us really successfully measure our journey towards reconciliation. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I do agree, and we actually do say that these are not meant to be exhaustive lists.
Exactly.
They're examples, and they may not be the ones, frankly, that prove to be relevant in every region of the country. Over time, we may see that in certain areas, drilling down in a certain area is more important than somewhere else. So it's an iterative thing. but it's not meant to be exhaustive. And it's not meant to assume that it's going to be perfect out the gate either.
Perfectly agree with you, but I just think it's really important that we have some quantifiable things, and there's some examples of very quantifiable things, so thank you for that.
It's not intended to say, gee, I wonder what we should measure. I mean, we've given some very particular things where we know we're in big trouble, and so let's start there.
Thank you. My last question before I run out of time, and I'm going to frame this very quickly. Dr. Wilton Littlechild, who was a member of both the interim board and the transitional committee, he expressed some frustration around the term efforts for in the legislation, that it's kind of fluffy or soft, I think is kind of the sense. And what we find in the legislation, even though it was not in the interim board's draft legislation, this term efforts for is 6 times in this legislation. And I'm just curious if you would support the amendments that would suggest maybe we should take out the words efforts for, and in the context what it would change is say, hey, we're actually talking about advancing reconciliation than just efforts for, that we are actually making. It kind of comes back to that measurable progress as well, I guess, if you would support that concept of maybe removing some of those terms like efforts for.
Yes, and I did specifically say that today, and I will make my written copy available, but I did say that somewhere in here.
Yeah, and you talked about it in the purpose section, but it's also a number of times in other places in the bill,
elsewhere.
So I want it to be the broader thing as well. That's why I asked.
I had 5 minutes, so I couldn't go.
Fair enough, and I appreciate you sending your written comments. That would be great. Thank you. I think I'm out of time, Mr. Chair.
You're right. Mr. Vidal, thank you very much, and we'll now go to Mr. McLeod for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the presenters today. Very interesting presentations. It's too bad we don't have more time for everybody to really put everything that they put together to talk about. Mr. Chair, I'm assuming we have confirmation that everybody will be providing their speaking notes to us to review. I wanted to ask a question to Marie Wilson, who's from the Northwest Territories. And it's good to see we have a representation from the North here. It's not something we always get with our witnesses. And I'm really glad that you talked about this whole issue being a Canadian issue versus an Indigenous issue. And it's so important, I think, to have a non-political oversight body. And this may be one body. We may need more. We may need another body for UNDRIP, for example. So, this is something that is important. And the makeup of how the directors that are on it is also important. We heard some comments to that effect today. And I think you know this very clear, that the North was, really affected. We had out of the 139 recognized residential schools, 32 were in the Northwest Territories, or in the Northwest Territories, Yukon, or Nunavut. So on a per capita basis, the impact was significantly higher in our region. So given this, and given the level of discussion on how directors should be selected or who should be a director, and the number of people that are talking about wanting seats as directors from the National Indigenous Organizations, I wanted to ask you if you could speak to the importance of having voices from the Territorial North appropriately included in the National Council of Reconciliation's board and their work.
Thank you, Mr. McLeod, for the question. I mean, I think it's a hugely important question, the makeup. And I commented on the issue of Indigenous-led because I think it easily slides into something being a formulaic answer rather than a really well thought out answer. And so the reason I questioned the use of that term, I know it's a term that's almost automatically used without a shared sense of what does it actually mean, and what does it mean? Does it mean numbers of people? Does it mean worldview? Does it mean lived experiences? Does it mean per capita impact, as you've just suggested? Does it mean residential school survivors? Does it mean awareness of the history and the current critical needs and representation based on that? doesn't mean commitment to shared principles of reconciliation. And I think if we are selecting a powerful council, that doesn't necessarily define around Indigenous or non-Indigenous or First Nations or Inuit or anything in a quantifiable quota way, but rather to those issues of where we know there's a real need in representation. We know that whenever we go on a per capita basis on any national committees, the North is always underrepresented. That's why you're able to make the comment you just made about having the North here. If you go on a per capita basis by population, the North will always be underrepresented. If you go on a criteria that talks about per capita impact of residential schools and the legacy, it would have the highest single representation because of the longest running schools over a multi-generational time frame. So I think that question of first of all, how big does a committee have to be functional, but also how does it structure itself so that you've got proper and informed voice and the proper matrix of skills you will need to be an effective national council. I think those are really, really critical issues. I do not have, if your question is, do I have a specific formula around that? No, I do not. But I think a vague one like that leaves itself open to just the usual political response of one from here, one, like that. And it doesn't always add up to the powerful mix you need.
Thank you for that. And I wanted to talk a little more about the composition and the work of the National Council for Reconciliation's board, and how important do you think that the survivors of the residential school system are included and involved? And I heard it was mentioned by another presenter here today, so I wanted to hear what you thought about that.
Well,
and Dr. Wilson, you'll have 45 seconds.
Okay. I'll just say, first of all, to be very clear, I have not been involved either at the level of the interim board or the transition team. So I don't know what thinking's already gone into that. I do know that the National Council, as we talked about at the level of the Commission, it needs to have some very particular skills. I do think it needs to have, as our TRC did, survivors at the heart of its purpose. And that can be as committee members, or it can be as a parallel circle, advisory circle. That's another way to do it. It's a different formula. But so that the heart and purpose of survivors and intergenerational survivors, as was mentioned as by one of the other interveners, that is ensured and assured.
Thank you very much, Mr. McLeod and Dr. Wilson. And nous irons maintenant, Madame.
We will now go to Ms. Gill for 6 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I also want to thank all of the witnesses as well, Zebdi Nungag, Ms. Wilson, and others. Thank you for your testimony. I have only 6 minutes, which is very brief, and so I will ask brief questions. I will ask two of the witnesses about representation. You talked about elders, and when we look at Section 12 of the legislation, it talks about young people, men, women, different genders, but there was no mention of survivors, and Ms. Wilson talked about that as well, and having contacts with the Innu community and know how important elders are for them. Elders are not mentioned in that section. You also talked about language. Perhaps because I am a Quebec MP, I am more sensitive to this, but I liked the fact that you raised that the fact that the Innu, who have their own language, have French as their second language, and that the work done by the Commission and other groups is mainly in English. So I would like you to address that and the fact that women are not specifically mentioned for parity. So I will ask first Ms. Chernish to answer my question. Thank you. Marilyn. When we talk about representation, proper representation on the board of directors, if we try to compare who has suffered the most harm or whether a given region should be represented more strongly because there were more residential schools there, well, that is part of our history. We have all suffered as First Nations members. I have never heard anyone tell their story and talking about representation, because everyone who's part of a First Nation in Canada has experienced these harms. I was quite struck by what the member said. I think it's important because perhaps you don't know this. There are residential school survivors who identify as survivors and others who call themselves former residential school students. So we need to allow these individuals to express their deepest sentiments, and that is difficult. The responsibility for that is shared around the table, because what I see in my region is that there hasn't yet been a dialogue between the survivors or former students and the children of those people. So I am the daughter of former residential school students, and I have not yet had the opportunity to discuss that experience with my mother. I'm sorry. The chief also needs a little time and only has 1.5 minutes. I'm sorry. Please go ahead, Chief. Thank you, Marilyn. I find it difficult to express myself in my second language because my feelings are very intense around this. In the early years, in the 1950s and 60s, I was in the second wave, if we can put it that way, of people that were picked up while they were playing and taken away to an unknown place. I just would remind you that I am a survivor, and perhaps soon no longer able to play this role, but I want to speak as a person who has French as a second language. We have a survivor who is 91 and who had 18 children, and all of those children were taken away to residential schools. So I would remind you that the elders are essential to involve in this process, and also women, because the intergenerational impacts are something we talk a lot about. But there is a great deal of sadness in our communities and our nation. So that's all I have to say. I don't want to talk any further about this, but we need better representation. Thank you very much, Chief. We will now go to Ms. Idlout for 6 minutes. Ms. Idlout.
Thank you, everyone. I thank each and every one of you for your testimonies. You came from far away to come and speak here because what you have to say is very important. And Chief Charles Petacho, I'm sorry if I didn't pronounce your name right, and I hear you. I love you. And I will be asking, we'll go straight to my question since my time is limited. First, I want to pose a question to Mr. Nunga. If we're going to have a strong national council for reconciliation, is it going? Are our rights as Indigenous people going to be taken into this consideration and addressed for their importance? Can there be a study be done to see if our organizations are supported by in this bill? Sorry.
C-29 doesn't talk enough about allowing the National Reconciliation Council to monitor whether Indigenous rights are being protected. And I wonder if you agree that maybe this council should also ensure that Indigenous rights are indeed being protected. Is there room for that kind of monitoring to happen by this reconciliation?
First of all, I am so happy to hear that when you are meeting in this meeting, I am really proud to hear my language being spoken here, because you have to hear our language too.
By talking about two things. One is the matter of the extinguishment and surrender of Indigenous rights, which was a condition for us signing the James Bay Agreement in 1975. The Cree and the Inuit, the Cree of James Bay and the Inuit of northern Quebec, were absolutely helpless about that condition, a precondition. We had nowhere to go to. We could not go to the Supreme Court to prevent this terrible extinguishment and surrender. And this totally destroyed the harmony amongst the Inuit of northern Quebec. The governments of Canada and the government of Quebec use that as a sledgehammer, as a precondition for any benefits to the Cree and Inuit to be put in a formal treaty or agreement. About 15 years after that, the government of Canada hired a judge named Hamilton to study and look for alternatives to extinguishment and surrender. The search was not serious enough to find a solution. So something like a National Council for Reconciliation could have done nothing but be helpful to finding a solution suitable for not just the Indigenous parties, but to governments in Canada. A difficult, terrible condition that we've had to live with since. So that's one example of something that can be that can be examined with a serious search for solution. The second example is I took part in the First Ministers' conferences of the 1980s, where the main goal of Indigenous parties in that process was begging Canada's provinces, territories, and the Government of Canada for the recognition of an inherent right to self-determination. We couldn't breach the fortresses of colonialism on that question. And the last First Ministers' Conference in 1987 ended with abject failure to find anything of the sort, although the governments were willing to recognize a contingent right, meaning by their good mercies and from them being the source of it, a right may be recognized. But we were pursuing a right that pre-existed the formation of Canada. That ended in failure. Then, 31 years later, on Valentine's Day, February 14, 2018, I woke up to watch the Prime Minister of Canada on television stand up in Parliament and recognize the Indigenous people's inherent right to self-government. I don't know what happened between the failure of 1987 and the Prime Minister's statement affirming such a right in 2018. But I think less time would have elapsed if something like a National Council of Reconciliation addressed important issues like that and find solutions for them, instead of waiting for the Prime Minister to get up on the right side of his bed that morning and recognize the right. So yeah, so that's my point.
Thank you.
This brings this panel to a close. I would like to thank again our witnesses today, Dr. Marie Wilson, former Commissioner of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, Mr. Zebedee Nungak for his appearance today, Madame Marjolaine Chernich, merci.
Thank you, the General Manager of the Institute Takapesh. And finally, Chief Jean-Charles Pietaccio, thank you very much for having expressed from your heart your ideas about this important piece of legislation, Bill C-29. Very much appreciated.
We will suspend momentarily as we prepare for our next panel. Thank you. We have Melissa Mbarki, qui est une analyste des politiques et
who is a policy analyst and outreach coordinator for the Indigenous Policy Program for the Macdonald-Laurier Institute.
We have Chief Willie Sellers of the First Nation of Williams Lake by video conference. And we also have Okalik Igisiak as an individual, also by video conference. So welcome to our three witnesses today. The way we do this, in case you weren't watching the first hour, is that you will each be given time to make a 5-minute opening statement, after which we'll go to the questions. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Melissa Mbarki to start us off with a 5-minute opening statement. Thank you. So I don't see Miss Mbarki. Is she in with the group?
She was. I don't know where she went. Let me see if tech can reach out to her.
Okay. Well, while you're doing that, I'm going to pass the microphone to Chief Willie Sellers if he's ready to give his 5-minute opening statement. Mr. Sellers, are you willing to start it off?
Yeah, I mean, I've never presented the panel, so opening statement in regards to who I am and where I come from. Is that what we're looking for today?
Well, you have an opportunity, Chief, to make a 5-minute opening statement if there are specific things you want us to be aware of with respect to Bill C-29. This is just sort of to set the table, if you choose to do so. And then we would go to, after all of the witnesses have spoken, we'll be going to a question period.
Melissa could go first. I see her on there. Please.
Okay, so is Melissa Mbarki with us now?
Yes, I am, and
okay,
I
good.
can start.
Okay, please go ahead with a 5-minute opening statement.
Thank you for allowing me to be here today to speak. I grew up on the Muskowgan First Nation located in Saskatchewan. The residential school on my reserve was operating from 1889 to 1997. The public school in the nearest town was a place for learning for the reserve children, the residential school children, and the farm and town children. My home was about 4 kilometers from the residential school. I could see the lights from my deck at night. Many children ran from this school, encountered a really rough terrain in my backyard. Sloughs, mud, uneven ice in the winter, and a dump site made it a dangerous path for children to take who ran away. We lost some of our community members in this area due to the condition in the winter. My earliest memory were of police searching this area if the staff at the residential school couldn't find a missing child or missing children who had run away. The residential school children made friends with the reserve kids, and many of the older kids in my community actually housed these children for as long as they could. The children did not want to be there. Many of them did not return. Many of them committed suicide while they were on visits with their family. My brother lost his friend in grade 1. I lost one of mine in grade 4. The children who left the residential school did so with little education. Many left with a grade 6 or 7. Many ended up in the child and family service system. Many committed suicide or passed in tragic accidents. Most ended up with drug, alcohol addictions and are homeless or are working in the sex trade today. Talking about residential schools is not a comfortable conversation to be had, but we must talk about the devastating impacts these schools had on Indigenous families and communities. We must come up with solutions to the social and economic issues we face today. It's been 25 years since the residential school closed on my reserve. We have no supports in place for anyone who attended this school. We don't have elder resources, timely mental health supports, or addictions, or even health services. The nearest place to access these services is either 45 minutes or an hour and a half away from my community. I don't think the committee will ever be nonpartisan. So let's make sure that we include people from all different viewpoints, include people of all ages, because the general public seem to think residential schools were 100 years ago. In actuality, the youngest residential school survivor in my community turned 33 this year. So this was in our lifetime, my lifetime. And oftentimes I find that people are quite surprised at how young I am when I speak on panels or I write about residential schools. I write about the impacts that this had on my community. but we need people who can speak for reserves. Like myself, community members will tell you what is needed. I feel like our voices are overshadowed by politics. And in the spirit of reconciliation, I hope that we can bridge the gaps between all levels of government. This is the only way we will move forward. We don't have time when people are dying on reserves from suicides and addictions. We don't have time when mass murders are happening on our reserves. We don't have time when my family, my nieces still live on the reserve. We don't have time. And what I want is we need accountability from every level of government. When funding announcements are made, we need to make sure these funds get to the communities that need them. And we need to see the outcome of what this money did. We don't currently have that. And that is very frustrating, especially from my viewpoint when I don't see things happening as quickly as they should be. Another thing that we need to address is poverty. You know, we must allow our communities to prosper. When I looked at the sections in the TRC report, in section 92, it mentioned building relationships and having access to jobs. But what about the funding? How do we get these jobs? How do we get access to training? That's the question that I am asking today. And I thank you all for being here today to listen and to hear my story, which is not very well heard out in the general public. A lot of people don't know the impacts that intergenerational trauma had on me and my family and my community. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Mbarki. We'll now go to Chief Sellers. If you wish to speak for 5 minutes, it's not necessary, but if you wish to, you have the microphone for 5 minutes.
No, I'd love to. And thank you, Melissa, for sharing your story. We look across this country at First Nation communities, First Nation reserves, and it doesn't matter how successful these communities are, we continue to see the same trends in, trying to narrow that socioeconomic or that social gap in our way of life and the health and wellness of our communities. I grew up my entire life on the Sugarcane Reserve, which is the Williams Lake First Nation, located just outside the city of Williams Lake. Surrounding Williams Lake is 14 different First Nation communities that range from the Secwepemc to the Jokoteen to the Teketh. Heading further out west, we have the Newhawk and then the Statlium to the south. And a lot of the First Nations from this region attended the St. Joseph's Mission Residential School, which is located 6 kilometers from the community core of WLFN or Sugarcane Reserve. It's where my dad went to school. We are a generation removed from residential schools in our community, but we're still seeing the trauma, the direct trauma, and the intergenerational trauma filter through in our way of life, and it's really impacting our balance as a community and as a people. This reconciliation discussion is continuing to happen across this country, and the wrong and the legacy of residential schools is coming to the forefront of discussions, and it's really helping the healing journey of our communities and our provinces, and at the end of the day, our country. But there is still so much work to do to narrow that gap. I mean, I don't want to be talking about when is reconciliation going to be achieved with local politicians and thinking that there's a price tag that's going to be attached to it. It's potentially generations from now that reconciliation is going to be achieved because of how much education is needed around this topic of discussion. I mean, we are currently we currently have an ongoing investigation over at St. Joseph's where we announced 93 anomalies last January. We're going to be doing a similar announcement for phase 2 of the investigation of the GPR work and of the research that we've been doing over the last couple of years. And this is a trigger not only for this region, but for this country every single time it happens. These triggers are happening on, a monthly basis almost because of the amount of schools in Canada and the history of those schools and those wrongs. Well, I mean, these triggers are happening, And I look into my community and how successful we've been over the last 2 years, over the past 5 years, over the past 10 years. We are an economic powerhouse in the city of Williams Lake, in the Caribou-Chilcotin region. We have numerous revenue streams. We reinvest our revenue back into the community. We have over 90 staff, 50% of which is funded through that own source revenue. We have programs and services. We have practically nil unemployment. We look at all the benefits of being WLFN and all the success that we've seen and all the opportunity that we have. We still have the same trauma in our community as everyone else does. We had 3 suicides this year. We had 3 overdoses this year and 2 suicides this year. I mean, for a small community like mine with an on-reserve membership of 300, with a overall membership pushing 800, I mean, that is a big number. And how are we going to find this balance as Indigenous people? The education component is a big part of that, but also this language, ceremony, culture revitalization discussion needs to have continued investment, not only through time, but also through money. And that's exactly where our focus is going. But having the partnership and having the support of the provincial and federal government is also going to be a big part of that discussion. Continue to educate the local municipality that is one of our neighboring municipalities at the city of Williams Lake is also a massive part of that discussion. And them having the pressure from other government entities to continue to stand beside us and hold us up and educate themselves is also going to be paramount in seeing the curve of health and wellness in our communities. And there is a lot of work to do around reconciliation, but at the same time, we also have to acknowledge all of the work that has been done to date and how the focus is continuing to stay on it. Let's continue to have this discussion and continue to push it so that people will catch up and people will, take that initiative and run with it, just like we have numerous examples across this country. But again, it should be a reminder of how much work that we still need to do. Mike Casell, on my relations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chief Sellers. We'll now go to our third witness, Okalik Igiziak, I'm sorry, Igisak. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My name is Okalik Igiziak, and I am from Iqaluit. And I am in Iqaluit. First of all, I want to acknowledge Laurie Idlout, Member Laurie Idlout, and Sabri Nungak, who was a witness. And it was really good to hear Sabri Nungak's appreciation of his language being used in this meeting. And I have known Mr. Nungak for a long time, and I'm proud of him.
On the next steps towards reconciliation. My background includes being past chair of the Inuit Circle Polar Council, an international Inuit body that represents and promotes and advocates for Inuit. I've also been a national president before ITK, before ITK was known as ITK, Inuit Tapiri Karatami. It was Inuit Tapiri Set of Canada. And I've also been a regional president for the Kikatoni Inuit Association here in the Baffin region. I'd just like to remind the committee and Canadians that at the creation of this commission, reconciliation does not start on that day. It started, I think, when first contact, and that we need a lot to do. We have a lot of work to do since then and since now. ICC, ITK, and the regions have done a lot of work, years and years and years of work, of doing reports, making recommendations to different governments, calling for things like community-based, Inuit-led, Inuit-managed policies, programs, and services, so that we could start to heal from the trauma that we've experienced, coming from and being led in a culturally sensitive way in Inuktitut. Let's build on the work that Inuit organizations and indigenous organizations have done already for a much stronger National Council on Reconciliation. Reconciliation. Will the Commission mean more and better and faster reconciliation, as that promotion campaign kind of effectively promotes? How slow or fast will it be? As you know, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission released its report and its recommendations a few years ago. And like everything else, we know that everything takes time. A lot of things takes time. Government is slow-mo, slow-mo, slow-mo. As you can appreciate, sometimes we get tired of waiting and get very impatient and frustrated. Reconciliation must come from a balanced approach, mindset and foundation with mutual respect and equitable resources. ICC, ITK, RIAs have always said that, equitable resources, not equally, but equitable resources. Indigenous services and programs from an Indigenous perspective and approach, such as education delivered in Indigenous languages and our culture being taught in the schools. And respecting, protecting, and promoting Indigenous rights, including elder rights and the rights we have negotiated for and in land claims agreements. Zebedee spoke a little bit about land claims agreements and some of the sacrifices or compromises that Inuit have experienced in negotiating and signing these agreements. And now we have issues and problems getting governments to meet their obligations in these agreements. If you want reconciliation, get the governments to meet these obligations where we have negotiated for increased resources to teach our language in the schools, as well as our culture, with a solid foundation of Inuit elders, and Inuit culture. For this commission, is it enough to monitor to affect change? Monitor to affect change. Is it enough to evaluate to encourage change? Will commission research with an investigative purpose? I heard some of the comments earlier that some of the leading phrases in the draft are not as strong as they could be. So this is where some of my questions are coming from. And what does reporting really mean? Like going back to the numerous reports that Indigenous peoples have helped develop and have released, what does reporting really mean? We all have experience and frustrations with important and critical reports that have been shelved. The Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples is one good example, and they're good recommendations. The TRC and how slow that has been.
Mr.
So,
Ms. Sigizak,
slow will that be?
We're going to have to get to questions. So if you could just wrap up, that would be good.
Done.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your opening testimony. We'll now go to questions, and we'll begin with Mr. Zimmer. According to my list here, Mr. Zimmer, you have 6 minutes.
I think it's going to be me, Chair.
No, Mr. Zimmer is being replaced by Ms. Goodridge, sir.
Okay, and I heard Mr. Schmale speak. So whoever it is, please go ahead. You have 6 minutes.
Well, thank you, Chair. I bet you wish that sometimes we stopped talking just as well as our friend from Nunavut just all of a sudden stopped. That was pretty amazing. Politicians should learn from her. I'm going to start with Ms. Mbarki, if I could. I want to talk to you about something I think you're very passionate about. That's economic reconciliation. We've heard from a few witnesses during this review of Bill C-29 about the need for someone to be at that table who is passionate and talks about economic reconciliation as a way to move forward. Do you agree?
I definitely agree. If you look at my opening statement and Chief Willie Sellers' opening statement, he said that his community has 0% or close to 0% unemployment. My community has 95% unemployment. So this variation across country and, with different reserves, it's definitely an issue that we need to address. I mean, there is absolutely no way forward in my community unless we get jobs, unless we end poverty, unless we bring services into my community. It could even be health services that could employ nurses, that could employ technicians. This is something that my community needs. So we have to look at the overall picture of what economic reconciliation looks like for each community, because it's going to look different for everyone. I work in the oil and gas sector. I have been working in this industry for 15 years. It's been an industry that has kept me out of poverty. If I had stayed in my community, I would have still been living in poverty. So we have to look at ways where we're not hindering development, where we're not hindering self-sovereignty, where we're not hindering communities from accessing some very beneficial employment and entrepreneurial opportunities. And that's what I'm continually seeing, is that because of this sector, employs quite a number of Indigenous people, it's actually, a lot of people are against it. And I think Indigenous people have a right to prosper however they want. And this is something that we should be looking at going forward. I don't think one committee can possibly take on all of our challenges. So my suggestion for this would be, separate this committee, have an economic side to it, have an education and language side to it, have a social side to it where we could implement healing centers or addiction centers. I don't think one committee can possibly handle all of this and give accountability numbers and so forth. So I think this definitely has to bring other players into the picture. And I don't think one committee can actually handle all of this.
I follow that up with a question regarding how we get there. Some Indigenous leaders have said that the Indian Act is broken, it's paternalistic, it's outdated, it's causing a lot of the problems we see here. Would you agree the Act is a hindrance in part to Indigenous economic reconciliation?
It's definitely hindering. It's a hindrance to communities because it's putting us in a box and saying that you need to do this, or if you want any kind of economic development in your community, you have to go by us first. So it's very paternalistic, and it doesn't allow communities to grow. It doesn't allow communities to prosper. And I think we have to move past that. I think we have to amend the Indian Act to allow us to be sovereign nations, to think for ourselves, to do for ourselves, because that's something that's missing out of the equation.
Thank you very much. I have so many more questions for you, but I just want to quickly go to Chief Sellers, if I could. Todd Doherty says, hello, by the way, Chief Sellers. You mentioned in your opening statement a lot about education. You also wrote about it in a CBC article where you talked about the healing process for Indigenous and non-Indigenous people and the move forward. You also talked a lot about economic reconciliation, just as Ms. Mbarki just mentioned. How do you see this playing out? You talked about in your opening remarks how you've been able to help move your community forward. Maybe tell us a bit about that and how important it should be here at the table when we examine C-29.
Yeah, I mean, the most challenging thing in Indian country is that all of our communities are, on different, different parts of their journey to healing. I mean, I look at WLFN and this big, bright, shining light that we are in Indian country and how we've been able to, spread our positivity throughout the region and get more and more allies come online with us. It has been through a lot of hard work by our team. I mean, we're a bit of an anomaly in this region when we start thinking about, the capacity that we have in-house to make the vision of council happen. We are a bit of an anomaly in our location, how we've been able to, find that consistency in our leadership to continue to realize that vision of healing. But again, I look at economic reconciliation and in our, aspirations to get to be a self-governing community. It has been through, the treaty process, but we've also taken these incremental steps to self-government. We are under the First Nations land management regime. We are governing over our reserve lands. We have a financial administration law. So these sectoral forms of self-government have allowed us to move at the speed of business and become this machine that works efficiently and is able to make decisions. And because of the capacity that we have on board, help us negotiate these deals and these agreements and start these other businesses that we've been able to see a lot of, success and prosperity with. I mean, where we're really struggling is that educational component to our healing and creating allies surrounding us and having people jump on board and stand beside us and hold us up. We just seen this massive turnover at the local municipal government, our neighboring community of Williams Lake. The mayor and 4 council positions were turned over in the latest municipal election. And a big part of that, I think, is because people want to see change. There's this new era of change that I think is rippling out across this country. And to say that all of our First Nation communities are in the same box, I mean, there is no way. We have over 200 communities, 200 First Nation communities in British Columbia alone, all different. But I mean, where we're seeing the consistencies is our aspirations to be successful, our aspirations to become healthy, not only on the mental health side, but also on that cultural, ceremonial, language side. And of course, our aspirations to make sure that that we are also contributing to what is the overall vision of this country, which is everybody working together. And by working together, acknowledging who the First Nations peoples are, whose territory that you're working in, and learning their history, educating yourself on, why our communities are the way that they are, the history of residential schools, and really holding up what reconciliation actually means. And I mean, we could really go on and on and on as we go down this
Thank you.
path.
How do you think?
I apologize for cutting off. We just have to keep to our schedule a little bit. Mr. Baptiste, you have the floor for 6 minutes.
Thank you for that. And I want to start off with Chief Sellers. Chief Sellers, you said that despite the economic success of your communities, you're still experiencing trauma, suicides, addiction. As someone who's from a Mi'kmaq community of 5,000, who also have seen successful Mi'kmaq communities, I've witnessed the same challenges. And there are those who would frame reconciliation as an economical thing, as saying that, if they had enough opportunity, if they had enough money, that somehow the harms caused through intergenerational trauma, through loss of culture, through loss of language would not be as important. Do you agree that reconciliation requires addressing the harm created, as well as creating pathways to prosperity?
100%. I mean, I have been in this politics game for some time now. I got elected in my early 20s. I sat on council for 10 years before becoming the chief in 2018. I was acclaimed in just this past summer. So I'm relatively young in this game. I have been able to learn and have my boots on the ground throughout this process. And, I just continue to think that, as hard of a discussion as it is to have around residential schools and the history of this country in regards to First Nations peoples, it's a discussion that we need to continue to have no matter how hard it is. I mean, I sat in this cultivating safe space training the other day with a young lady from Sils Nation, Elaine Alec, and one of the comments that she made really resonated with me. She said, we're getting conditioned to continue to hear those stories about residential schools, a lot of us anyways, where, I hear these horrific stories about the St. Joseph's Mission. We're going through this investigation now. And, I'm conditioned not to react to them. I'm conditioned, it seems like, not to cry or show emotion. But I'll be watching a commercial on TV and something will remind me of a story that I heard, positive or negative, and I'll break down and I'll start crying. And, like I think about the hockey rink, for example, and I break down. I was triggered because the only stories that I ever heard about the St. Joseph's Mission from my dad were about the hockey rink. And dealing with these different triggers, they vary for people across this country and across our First Nations communities. There's no, one size fits all solution to all of these things. What we do, we need to continue to educate the non-Indigenous people of this country, keep the discussion at the forefront so that people continue to be empowered to bring this up, share their story so that they could heal themselves. We want to break that generational gap that we're seeing in all of our communities. We want to break that cycle. I'd like to think that the cycle is being broken with my 3 kids and my kid that is also going to be born any day. We're due on Saturday. But they're going to grow up in an era of their dad was there every single day of their lives. Their mom was there every single day of their lives. That luxury is not the same and is not consistent across our communities. And, how do we break that gap? How do we break that cycle? Education is going to be the biggest part of that, in my opinion, so that when I talk to the city of Williams Lake mayor, he understands the history of First Nations people and why it is so important for him to stand beside us and hold us up, not only in projects on the ground for economic reconciliation, but also participating in the ceremonies and the events that we're having in community to show and prove that he is a leader and he's standing beside us and he's being that example.
Thank you for that answer, Chief. Melissa, I want to go to you next. You said that, when you talked about the major gaps that exist between your community and the rest of Canada, now TRC calls to action talk about closing the gap between education, health, access to justice. I wonder if you could speak to the importance of closing the gap between on and off reserve as a fundamental step towards the oversight that needs to take place by the independent committee.
Sure. My community is actually an hour and a half to the nearest city. It's 2.5 hours if we go north. So it's very hard for community members to access even something as simple as a blood test. They have to drive for this. This is not easy. For them to, get out of the community and access. One of the things that we really learned during COVID was that we had very limited access to health services. We didn't even have access to isolation units. We couldn't take out those who had COVID out of the family home so that they can isolate while they were sick. They infected an entire family. And if you look at an entire, a family structure on the reserve, you could have 2 or 3 different families living in one home. So that really impacted us. And I think that's one of the things that we do have to bridge sooner rather than later. Because if there's another pandemic that happens, we're going to go through the exact same thing where the military is going out to help. We have to start looking at solutions to different situations like health. Another thing is mental health services. Once again, it's 2 hours away. That this shouldn't be happening. I'm in a community where there's actually 4 that are around me. So it would be really easy to bring in one service that could be accessed by 4 communities. It doesn't necessarily mean that one community is going to get a health center. We can all access and share these types of services, even mental health services. And I think that's where bridging the gap comes into play, even with economic reconciliation. If we bring in jobs, a certain company, it encompasses the surrounding community. So it's not just available for one like mine, it could be shared. And I think these are things that we definitely have to start thinking about.
Thank you very much, Mr. Baptiste. Nous irons maintenant à Madame Gill.
We will now go to Ms. Gill for 6 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all of our witnesses, Ms. Mbarki, Mr. Chief Sellers, and Mr. Igiziak. And I give my best wishes to Chief Sellers on the upcoming birth of his child. I want to talk about any improvements that you would like to suggest. Ms. Mbarki and Mr. Sellers are members of the younger generation of Indigenous people, and so I would like to have the perceptions from you about any changes you would like to see for young people, and from any of the witnesses about improvements in general that can be made. Mr. Chairman, perhaps Ms. Mbarki could speak first, and then Mr. Giziak, and then Mr. Sellers, Chief Sellers.
I beg your pardon. I was muted. Miss Mbarki, did you get the translation? You're being asked to comment first.
No, I didn't get the translation. Sorry.
Okay. All right. We'll start over then. Do you have your interpretation button selected on your? It's the little globe at the bottom. You see at the bottom of your screen what looks like a globe of the world?
Yes.
It says interpretation. If you hit that and choose English, if that's the language you want to hear it in, it'll translate and give it to you in English.
Okay, I have it.
You have it? Good. Okay. Alors, Madame Gill.
Ms. Gill, we will start the clock again. So please repeat your question. Thank you. I will once again thank all 3 witnesses, Ms. Mbarki and Mr. Gisiak and Chief Sellers. I wanted to congratulate him on the upcoming birth of his child. And I want to hear from all of you about any improvements you think are needed to the bill. There is a lot of work to be done, and you and Chief Sellers, as part of the younger generation, I would like to hear in particular what you might suggest. So I was asking for Ms. Mbarki to start, followed by Mr. Igisiak and Chief Sellers.
One of the improvements that I think that definitely can be done is creating subunits under this act. We cannot address all the issues in our communities under one sort of board. We need to look at it in separate parts, and we definitely need to address these different parts differently. We need a different road on each one, whether it's language and culture, whether it's education, whether it's economic, whether it's, social programs like drug and alcohol addictions and treatment centers. I think separating these out would give us a better perspective on what is happening in each area. And what I fear is that one area is going to take precedence over another. So if it's culture and language, that could take precedence over economic reconciliation. So we really need to think about it in terms of what we want to do and how we're going to go about doing it. Because right now, having this all lumped into one is going to be chaos. How do you measure all of this? And that's what I would like to see looked at and possibly changed.
Et peut-être juste une question
Perhaps just a follow-up question for Ms. Mbarki. If one were to create the subunits, would you feel that the resources, as they have been indicated, are sufficient?
That's one of the things these subunits will address. Is one area getting more money than the other? Is one area being neglected over another? So there's no possible way that we can measure all of this with this being under one umbrella. But if we start parsing it out and having different subunits, we can definitely see that the money invested in each and what the outcome is. It would be easier to measure, and it would give some accountability to the people and to Indigenous communities.
So thank you. And Madame Igisak, would you like to answer the question for Madame Gill, please?
Sure. I'll just repeat some of the stuff that I said in my opening remarks, where the commission, as drafted, will monitor, evaluate, conduct research, and report. What does that really mean? Is that enough to affect change? To just monitor, evaluate, conduct research, and report? Will there be ability to challenge government or governments on reconciliation and how they are trying to improve partnerships with Indigenous peoples? And sometimes I have a problem with initiatives that promote co-development, co-management, co, when we have the ability to lead as Indigenous peoples, because we know best what is happening in our communities, and we know best how to overcome some of the barriers and challenges we have to make life in the community better. So I think sometimes we have to re-examine the colonial approach to co-development when we can lead.
Thank you, Ms. Giziak.
J'aurais une question, Monsieur le Président.
I just have a question, if I can, for Ms. Igiziak. You talked about these. Are you talking about the bill or about the council? I just wanted to have that clarification. Where is this in the bill exactly? What you're referring to?
Preamble. It's in the preamble where it says,
Merci.
whereas the government of Canada recognizes.
Merci.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Merci.
Thank you, Ms. Giziak. And Chief Sellers, would you like to weigh in on the question?
Yeah, the concept of the bill and overseeing this reconciliation discussion is a great one. I mean, in theory, for sure, it's something that is definitely needed. I'm just honestly trying to wrap my head around. I mean, as we've heard from the other speakers, and I brought up as well, all of the communities are just so different in where they're at. I mean, our community, for example, in Williams Lake we did $20 million in development over the past 2 years in this region. I mean, compared to one of our neighboring communities in the same region, I mean, we're way further advanced, and it's mainly based on location. We've really struggled holding up our culture because more was lost than, let's say, a rural community 3 or 4 hours from the city of Williams Lake, and how much we've been able to retain. So reinvesting back into our priorities are just a little bit different. I mean, where we've been able to progress, we're further along. We're the tip of the spear for communities to follow and see the example that we've set. But again, I mean, there is just no one size fits all in this discussion that we need to realize, and we're developing this committee and passing this bill. We have to acknowledge that all of these communities are different, and there's this further in-depth sub-education that needs to happen throughout the process, so that we're understanding how we can help these individual communities, these separate nations, for the overall picture of what a healthy Canada looks like.
Thank you, Chief Sellers. Merci, Madame Gill. We'll now go to our final questioner, Ms. Idlout.
Thank you. I just have a question for Ms. Ukalik-Ijitia. First question I have for you is, do you agree that Indigenous people's rights are protected? By this do you agree that the National Council of Reconciliation is supportive of Indigenous rights?
I think as the commission is being created, terms of reference will have to be developed. And I myself think that protection and promotion should be one of the pillars of protecting and promoting Indigenous rights. If I answered that question, I'm not sure.
Yes, thank you for answering my question. Now, the next question is, I just want to share with you, in the House today, there was an historic moment when in our divisions, in our parties, we all supported and supported Madame Gazan's motion to acknowledge that what happened in residential schools are acts of genocide. This was a very big thing to us. In light of this, what do you think the next step should be to proceed towards reconciliation?
As well right now, where if my statistics are right, or if my recollection is right, for every I think it's 100,000 Canadians, there's 2 police in the South. Up here, it's for every 1,000 Canadians, there's 2 police officers. So, it's kind of a police state, and coming from a colonial approach, yes, I agree. And I congratulate the NDP for getting a motion in place that was supported by all parties.
Did I answer correctly? Yes, thank you. Now, I just want to ask you, would you support a motion that can strengthen and empower the rights of Indigenous peoples?
Thank you, Laurie. I think one of the things that I could expand upon to the previous question was that, implement the TRC recommendations and implement different reports and recommendations that the Commission can also build on, and stop kind of romanticizing the relationship and partnerships governments take and have with Indigenous peoples. Romanticizing, and I mean by, I don't know what I mean by it, um, but yeah, just implement recommendations and implement land claims agreements with adequate resources and equitable resources.
You have 30 seconds, Ms. Seedloud, if you wish to use them.
Thank you. Now, while I have this opportunity, I just want to thank each and every one of you, because once this, we would like to see more empowerment to bodies that are addressing the issues faced of past residential schools and past attempts to commit genocide of Indigenous peoples. So I just want to say now that I would like to see our rights as Indigenous peoples supported and recognized. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Seedloud, and that brings our panel to a close. I would like to thank our three witnesses this afternoon for their very strong testimonies. Miss Melissa Mbarki, Chief Willie Sellers, and Miss Igiziak. Thank you very much for giving of your time today. Sorry we started a little bit late, but you've contributed in an important way to our deliberations as a committee on C29, and we very, very much appreciate it. That brings this panel to a close. And for the committee members, just a reminder that on Monday, we'll also be hearing from the Transitional Committee, and a reminder as well that any proposed amendments to C29 have to be in by noon on Tuesday. Thank you very much, everyone. And with that, this meeting is adjourned.
Président.